it's difficult to understand this now because we know everything that we think we know about the legend. But in 1947, it was just a flash in the pan. It was a story that was actually reported around the world when the US Army Air Force Base put this press release out to say they'd captured a flying saucer, and naturally it would do because it's a sensational claim. Even in my local paper here in Yorkshire, the Sheffield Telegraph, it was on the front page. US Army Air Force captures flying saucer, but within 48 hours, the wreckage had been sent to Fort Worth, where it had been examined by the meteorological office there, who basically said it's a weather balloon. And there was a press conference called. There's some very famous photographs of people holding the wreckage, and I think even some of the proponents accept that what is being held is the actual wreckage. It hadn't been switched or anything. If you look at those photos, it doesn't look anything otherworldly at all. It looks exactly what you would expect from some kind of balloon, with strips of wood and bits of metallic paper, things hanging from it, and a radar reflector, that kind of thing. It's exactly what you would expect. That's what happened. And then the story was completely forgotten about. If you look, I mean, I've got a huge collection of books on UFOs and flying saucers from the 1950s up to the present. It is not mentioned, the Roswell incident is not mentioned in any of those books and articles and magazines during the 1950s, during the 1960s. It's not until 1980, when the book, The Roswell Incident, which was co-authored with Charles Berlitz and Robert Moore, was published, and a guy called Stanton Friedman, who was very important Canadian nuclear physicist, sadly now dead, who was very much pushing this idea of there being a huge cover-up by the US military of what they knew about UFOs. They got together and produced this book, and they went and re-interviewed some of the people who were there at the time, who were still alive in 1980. Jesse Marcel, for instance. And there's no other way to describe him. He was a UFO believer. He basically bought into the whole idea that flying saucers were craft from outer space. And unusually, if we go back to that Gallup poll that I was talking about, very small number of people in 1947 thought that these things that people were seeing were craft from outer space. But Jesse Marcel clearly was one of those people. And when he found this wreckage, he just would not have it that this was something that was made on Earth. And he was still telling that story in 1978. But by that point, as with all stories, this is how folklore works. If you imagine a snowball that starts at the top of a slope and it rolls down, and the snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and when someone keeps telling a story, anyone will know this from stories that you tell yourself, to your small group of friends, and then it gets to a bigger group of friends. You embellish it, you put extra details in, you leave things out, and over the 20 or 30 years between 1947 and 1978, this story had turned into, this was a crash flying saucer, that there was a huge cover-up, that the material was switched and substituted for something else, that people were threatened. Bullets are cheap was the phrase that was used, I think, in one of the stories. Lots of other people then came out of the woodwork claiming, yes, we were there, we saw bodies of aliens. And there's people who worked in the morgue, apparently the hospital morgue at Roswell, who said that they remembered this truck turning up with armed guards and these small bodies of creatures being offloaded. And I think this is where the idea for the alien autopsy came from, although it was then turned into a film that, as emerged, was completely a hoax. But the idea that this thing had crashed and that there was creatures inside it and they were autopsied came from some of these stories that grew out of the original story. You've got to look at it in context, because it wasn't the only story about a crashed flying saucer or a crashed spaceship that came from that part of America at the time. And going even further back in time, to the Victorian period, in 1896, 1897, there was a wave of similar sightings of strange objects in the sky over the Midwest, and these were described as phantom airships. And again, the newspapers played up these stories, This was an object that was seen at night with searchlights on it. Sometimes people said it had landed and they'd met the crews and it was some sort of secret inventor, like a Jules Verne character who'd perfected this lighter-than-air craft. And there's a really legendary story from a tiny town in Texas about how this airship crashed into a windmill, and the townspeople ran to the wreckage and found it was actually a craft from Mars, and they retrieved the body of this Martian pilot, buried it in the local cemetery, and they retrieved bits of metal from this airship that had got hieroglyphics on. Now, it sounds very much like the Roswell incident, but this was in 1897, and it's since emerged that that was actually a hoax by a newspaper. And the little town, the railroad had missed it, and it was sort of an attempt to get people to come to this little town called Aurora in Texas. But that's almost like a carbon copy of the Roswell incident. And again, going even further back forward in time, in 1950 there was a book called Behind the Flying Saucers that was written by a guy called Frank Scully, a journalist, and that claimed that 6 flying saucers had crashed at a place called Aztec in New Mexico, and that the American military had retrieved these objects, and they'd broken into these saucers and found hieroglyphics inside and small creatures, the classic little green men. So what we're talking about here, it's a legend, it's something that's been going on for centuries, and Roswell is just one tiny sort of manifestation of it, the one that's caught people's attention.